on the novel Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This was recorded by Darren Donate for his English 660 class. I want to begin this video presentation by talking about the author, James Baldwin. He was born in 1924 to Emma Jones. The sources that I read claim that Baldwin never knew his father. His father might have been a drug addict, but his mother was remarried to Baptist preacher David Baldwin. In his first novel, Go Tell It to the Mountain, which was published in 1953, it rose to acclaim and is considered one of the greatest English novels of the 20th century. Baldwin was extensively well-traveled. He settled in different places in Europe, France, Switzerland, Turkey, and these experiences ultimately shaped and influenced his writing. In his work, Baldwin explored the psychosocial pressures of queer peoples, racial dynamics, and existing class structures in American life. I was really interested in the publication history of Giovanni's Room. It was kind of hard to publish. Alfred A. Knopf published his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, in 1953, but rejected Giovanni's Room due to its explicit homosexual content. And the publishers at Alfred A. Knopf warned Baldwin that Giovanni's Room would ruin his reputation. And to sort of clarify that point, they were talking about ruining his reputation with the African American community. The novel was ultimately published in 1956 by Dial Press, and I think that this brief publication history really showcases the pressures of writing black, and I think that the publishers worried about how the African American community was going to receive Giovanni's Room was really telling of their concerns, telling him to kind of subsume or reject one of his identities, right, as a gay man, and to play more up his African American identity is it's really sad and disappointing. But ultimately, we have Giovanni's Room. Today we get to read it, and that's great. It's a wonderful piece of literature. I think it's also interesting to consider how these publishers really didn't see Giovanni's Room as exploring like white male masculinity and the privileges that it affords. And I see this Giovanni's Room not only as a piece of literature, right, but it's also a study of white male masculinity. I think it's really interesting because of that. So one of the articles that I stumbled on that I think is really interesting was published by Duke University Press, and it's written by Harry Thomas. It's called Immaculate Manhood, The City and the Pillar, Giovanni's Room, and the Straight Acting Gay Man. In this essay, he compares The City and the Pillar, written by Gore Vidal, to Giovanni's Room, and how they share very similar themes and also writing strategies. But the thing that I find most interesting about this essay is this point that is highlighted in the above quote, which reads, "In Giovanni's Room, in contrast, the straight-acting gay man is an object of critique, and David's obsessive investment in maintaining an immaculate masculinity untainted by femininity is a primary source of the ruination he inflicts on himself and on others." I think that there's something problematic with the term straight-acting gay man, but the idea about David's obsession and his investment in masculinity is something that is key to sort of my interest in the novel, and I think that it's a waypoint for us to examine other sort of themes and ideals present in the novel. So the ones that I really want to discuss are homophobia and masculine identity, racial and class dynamics, and then also the room as a place of simultaneous domesticity and revolution. I want to begin discussing masculine identity by first examining the relationship between Jacques and David. So Jacques is a Belgian-born American businessman, right? Throughout the novel, you get the sense that David doesn't really like Jacques. He kind of thinks of him as piggish. And in this quote, we kind of get a sense of those feelings. Jacques was immediately attracted. I felt him, so to speak, preparing himself for conquest. I felt the necessity for tolerance. So he doesn't really like him. He kind of thinks of him as piggish. But he hangs out with him because he is rich, right? He gets people drunk. He feeds David. And I think that the repulsion towards Jacques is not only one of Jacques' character, right, but it's also because of his feminine expressions and his leaning towards like the flamboyant. And I think for him, and as we continue this presentation, you'll see instances where David isn't entirely comfortable with those demonstrations outside of what we would perceive to be like heteronormative, like masculinity, right? So I think him being placed in this relationship where, Jacques is the wealthier of the two and he's paying for all these things, and he sees Jacques act in a certain way that doesn't align with his values is very uncomfortable, right? Um, and I think that I think you see this again with Giovanni and Jacques, and I think Giovanni with sort of his homophobic remarks. I think that there is like that that demonstration of imbalance, not only through wealth but also like through values and through um, different social lenses. And that kind of goes on to this idea of like gender performance. And this is strictly examining the relationship between David and Giovanni. So in this quote, Giovanni is they're still living together, and David is sort of figuring out how to navigate this new relationship, right? And he sees himself playing the housewife, right? I threw out the paper, the bottles, the fantastic accumulation of trash. I examine the contents of innumerable boxes and suitcases and dispose of them. But I am not a housewife. Men can never be housewives. So, what's really interesting to me, and it's something that I do want to bring up later in this presentation, is how for David, who's so invested in masculinity, he can only see it in really like black and white, right? Um, the room itself offers privacy and a place where these like gender expressions don't really have to exist, right? But David is so sort of chained to these normative expressions that he can't imagine a life otherwise without them, right? So this idea of men can never be housewives is something that is brought routinely throughout the novel, and especially when we get to Hella's character and how sort of David sees his future with her, I think is really interesting. Um, so David's relationship with Hella, it's sort of him reclaiming his masculine identity. One of the quotes that I picked out, I hope to burn out through Hella my image of Giovanni and the reality of his touch. So he is very much in love with Giovanni in a very physical level, right? But this relationship is the pinnacle of white heteronormativity. Hella is a beautiful white woman, and David ultimately wants to choose this white middle class heteronormativity. And I think it's really interesting when we examine the line "men can never be housewives," right? Or "men never can be housewives." Um, it's sexist, but it also shows how David is really ready to displace Hella into the role of the dismissed housewife, right? Of the person that takes care of the kids, and he sees sort of um, that role fit into women, right? And he doesn't want to fall into that role himself, which again is really interesting. In the next quote, he says, I wanted children. I wanted to be inside again with the light and safety, with my manhood in question, watching my woman put my children to bed. So right here he's making an explicit statement like, I don't want to feel this way. I don't want my white male masculinity to be challenged in any sort of way. For him, he says, I wanted a woman to be for me a steady ground like the earth itself, where I could always be renewed. It had been so once, it had almost been so once. I can make it so again. I can make it real. So, um, again, I think that while Giovanni's room, it sort of offered a safety from the world. As soon as he stepped away from it, that safety was gone. And I think that the reality of him maybe not being afforded the privileges of being a white masculine male, we're setting in a little bit. Um, and I think this quote really demonstrates that. There's also this idea of like not performing the role of masculinity that David is really attached to. So um, when talking about trans people, he says, I always found it difficult to believe they ever went to bed with anybody. For a man who wanted a woman would certainly have rather had a real one, and a man who wanted a man would certainly not want one of them. So again, he feels like this aversion towards trans people because they're not performing the role of masculinity. And I don't think if we apply a psychoanalytic lens to this book, I think that you mostly see that he's worried about himself, right? He's worried about whether or not David himself is performing the role of masculinity. So if we look back on those quotes about him being a housewife, right, he's more concerned about himself. And I think that he looks at the outside world to try to like find answers um, to how to make his life simpler and easier, and he like lashes out with transphobia and homophobia because he can't really he doesn't completely understand this part of himself. There's another moment of homophobia that I left off in this presentation where I think Giovanni is talking about his future son and how he would be, the hypothetical son would be away from these quote fairies, right? So again, I think that this pain is inflicted towards gay men, but it's also something that's like very much internalized, and it's sort of interesting to see how all these competing ideals of masculinity are intertwined with different male characters throughout the novel. Um, there's also the question of class and race between David and Giovanni. And David, ultimately comes from the American middle upper class, and Giovanni, he's a former laborer, and now he's a bartender, right? And he's poor and he lives paycheck from paycheck. And um, David is asks his father for money, and he receives it. And I think that there's sort of like distances there. I couldn't find any quotes that really talked about Giovanni's appearance. And while there might not be an ethnic difference, right, where Giovanni is described as being darker, there's certainly like a cultural difference here, right? And it's interesting to see that play out. David is quoted as saying, "Italians are too fluid, too volatile, have no sense of measure," right? So I think that cultural difference and the question of culture here is like incredibly important, and it is also something that um, plays a part in this novel. And in David, in some senses, right, he's aware of his own whiteness and his privilege. And in page 3, he says, "My ancestors conquered a continent, pushing across death-laden plains until they came to an ocean which faced away from Europe into a darker past." So um, my ideas sort of surrounding the novel and it being a study of white male masculinity, I think it's really clearly stated in this passage here, and also I think the previous one where they actually describe David's appearance as being, being white. Um, I think that it really sets the tone for the entirety of the novel and also kind of states its purpose clearly. Um, the last point that I want to discuss is the placement of Giovanni's room. Um, so the room for me symbolizes like the fluidity of gender expression and sexuality because they're afforded privacy in the space, right? But ultimately, this sort of expression and this nature is endangered because while like they could be safe inside this room together, once they step outside, the pressures of the outside world and reality make this impossible. Um, and on the surface level, you could say the room symbolizes the mental state of Giovanni, right? So, uh, you know, David's constantly cleaning it up, and then by the end of it, it's dirty. David's no longer with Giovanni, and he ends up uh, getting the death penalty. But what I think is interesting about Giovanni's room, the room itself, is how um, it is a place of domesticity, but it could also be seen as a revolution, right? So these gay men they never were offered sort of a model of what this relationship would look like in the home, right? And when they try to build it, David is so concerned about his masculinity that it ultimately deteriorates, right? And his he can only see things through a black and white lens, right? And this space of being inside the room offered them a mode of experimentation and expression that I think otherwise would have been unafforded in any other sort of situation, right? And it's interesting to consider how this experimentation never took place, right? And it really makes me sort of question um, maybe what were the prevailing ideas surrounding um, like different homosexual groups and how homosexual relations should be enacted. And I think that when we're considering sort of the transphobia in this novel as well, we sort of see a separation between, um, different LGBTQ plus, like members of the community. Like you don't really see them well aligned when there's this novel, and you see um, I guess the different ideas surrounding masculinity certainly affected how these expressions would take place and how I guess domestic relationships between two same-sex couples would look like. But I think it's just really interesting how this experimentation never took place within the novel. So yeah, that is my presentation. I hope you all have a lovely day, and I hope that you got something out of this.